Welcome back to the Everything History podcast for episode 40, Overview, Augustus to Diocletian. The podcast is now shifting to a new topic of interest, and that topic is the writings of the ancient Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus. But before I can get into Ammianus and his great but fragmented history, I must conduct an overview of what has happened between Augustus and the late 4th century CE.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Now, as you might imagine, this overview will not be nearly comprehensive enough, but it will hopefully be enough to allow you to get acquainted with the change in time period. The time I am going to cover is from 14 CE to the end of Diocletian's reign with his retirement in 305. I plan on covering instances in that swath of time more in depth later, but for now I will simply dedicate an episode to those centuries. For this reason, I will not be citing any specific sources. I'll just be giving you the bare bones of the history over those centuries. And I plan on covering instances in that swath of time more in depth later, but for now I will simply dedicate this episode to those centuries. And in that time, a lot changed, but a lot stayed the same. The key values, virtues, and traditions of Rome did not change. Regardless, I return to Augustus. He died in 14 CE, and he was succeeded by the Julio-Claudian dynasty of emperors. This dynasty lasted from 27 BCE to 68 CE. But sadly, Augustus's successors were not worthy of his powers. The only other decent emperor of the bunch was Claudius, but he fell prey to the fatal intrigue that plagued the Julio-Claudian family. Indeed, there was much hatred, violence, and backstabbing among these emperors and their families. For example, Caligula was assassinated, Claudius was killed by his wife Agrippina so she could make her 15-year-old son Nero emperor, and Nero ended up killing his mother and overseeing a horrific series of events. Nero committed suicide in 68 CE, bringing the dynasty of the Julio-Claudians to an end. The next year, 69, is known as the Year of the Four Emperors, or the Long Year. In that year, civil war returned to the Roman world, and it was a Roman general that came out alive by the name of Vespasian. Vespasian founded the Flavian dynasty, which lasted from 69 to 96 CE, and he was succeeded by his sons Titus and Domitian. Famously, it was during Titus's short reign that Mount Vesuvius erupted and engulfed the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. It was also under Titus that the Flavian amphitheater was opened, otherwise known to us as the Colosseum. Titus, however, died young in 82 CE and was succeeded by his brother Domitian. Domitian proved to be paranoid, and his reign spiraled downwards until his assassination in 96 CE. What came afterwards was not a civil war, but the greatest era of Roman peace. Indeed, the time between 96 and 180 CE is the heart of the Pax Romana. The rulers during this most prosperous time were the 5 good emperors, otherwise known as the Antonine dynasty. The Antonines began their rule actually because of the Roman Senate, because after Domitian's assassination in 96, the Senate was the first to react, and they appointed a member of their own rank, Nerva. The only problem was that Nerva was an old man. So even when the Senate won, they made bizarre decisions. Nerva only ruled for a short 2 years, but his greatest decision was who he chose as his successor. Nerva chose Trajan, a Roman general from Spain, who was beloved by the army and a most capable man. Nerva secured this transition of power by adopting Trajan as his son. This was enough to qualify the elderly Nerva as one of the 5 good emperors. Trajan succeeded him, and he was the first emperor born outside of Italia. Trajan conquered Dacia beyond the Danube, funded great events and projects, and expanded the borders of the empire to their greatest extent. For his great deeds, Trajan was awarded by the Senate the title of Optimus Princeps, meaning the best ruler or greatest citizen. The next 3 good emperors were Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Hadrian actually oversaw the retraction of Roman territory because he believed, like Augustus, that Rome would be too difficult to control if it expanded even further. And Rome certainly could have conquered more territory, but it would have been unmanageable dead weight, and Rome's greatest emperors were aware of this. Hadrian's nickname was Graeculus, meaning Little Greek, an affectionate name given for his sponsorship and proclivity for Greek art and history. Hadrian was also very much a homosexual. Antoninus Pius's rule we know almost nothing about, due to a lack of histories, but also because his reign was so peaceful that nearly nothing happened worthy of note. Antoninus was succeeded by two men, actually, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. Lucius Verus died fairly early on, though, so he is usually forgotten, and because Marcus Aurelius was such a magnanimous figure. Indeed, Marcus Aurelius was the last of the good emperors, and is sometimes referred to as the philosophic emperor, because Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher. In fact, his text Meditations still survives to us, and I strongly recommend it to any and all audiences. During his reign, Marcus Aurelius maintained the peace and defeated the Germanic tribes in a series of engagements. The only problem was that upon his death in 180 CE, he was succeeded by his natural-born son, Commodus. And Commodus proved to be absolutely awful. But before I move on to Commodus and thereafter, let me make a few notes about the 5 good emperors. Their era of rule in the 2nd century was the most prosperous and peaceful time in the Roman Empire, and quite possibly Roman history. The economy was strong, art and architectural movements were vibrant, and the military remained stable as it continued to function as Augustus designed them to be on the Roman frontiers. This prosperity was due to the leadership of the emperors, of course, and because of the system Augustus designed. Indeed, when the Principate was controlled by the likes of Trajan and the other good Antonines, they were administering and executing the office of princeps, just as Caesar had hoped. The reason the Pax Romana and the 5 good emperors had such a run of success, though, is very important, and it's a bit of an elephant in the room. The elephant in this case being the fact that none of them, until Marcus Aurelius, had natural-born sons. This forced them to choose their own successor on the basis of merit. And when the good emperors found a man they believed worthy of succession, they kept an eye on them, and when the time was right, they brought them into their family through adoption. The succession by adoption system isn't perfect either, but it is much more reliable at producing capable leaders than the regular dynastic family succession. And adoption is the reason for the 5 good emperors. Now, back to Commodus. He ruled from 180 to 192 CE, and was the last and worst of the Antonines. He cared little for administration, and instead fell to the vices of lust, avarice, and disillusion. He thought of himself as a great warrior, famously fighting in a few gladiator bouts, but he was really nothing of a fighter, although he portrayed himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. Commodus was assassinated in 192, and Rome fell back into chaos and civil war. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal soldiers, sold the empire to the highest bidder, a senator by the name of Didius Julianus. The Praetorians soon realized the shameful nature of their deed, killed Julianus, and 192-193 became the year of the 5 emperors. Like in the case of Vespasian and the Flavians, another Roman general emerged triumphant. The man was Septimius Severus, and he founded the Severan dynasty, the last successful imperial dynasty before the transformation of the early imperial period to the late imperial period. Septimius Severus proved to be quite a capable emperor, and he was quite the workhorse, evidently completing paperwork and his duties of office as princeps until his last breath, literally. The rest of the Severans, his sons and extended family, were not so capable. After Severus died in 211, he was succeeded by his sons Yeta and Caracalla. Caracalla had his brother killed and almost any memory of him erased through a decree of damnation of memory. Notably, during Caracalla's reign, the Antonine Constitution was passed. This law granted citizenship to all within the Roman Empire. By this stage of the empire, though, this did not matter so much because the value of citizenship had waned drastically since the days of Augustus. The other Severans after Caracalla were Elgabalus and Alexander Severus. Elgabalus was quite insane, he died quickly, and Alexander proved to be easy to manipulate, especially by the powerful women of the Severan dynasty, the Julias. Alexander ruled for over a decade until the army assassinated him in 235 CE. Before I move on to the chaos that followed the death of Alexander Severus, I should slow down once more to touch on the more nuanced societal changes during the years of the Severans. Under their rule, Rome was once more at peace, but, as you might have picked up on in my tone when discussing them, their rule was not a time of prosperity or stability. It seems stable on the outset, but if we look into the historical microscope more clearly, we find that it was actually quite a bad era in the Roman Empire. The imperial era of the Severans is a poor one in retrospect in subtle ways. One source of the instability relates to the emperors themselves. Only Septimius was a truly capable leader. The rest of the dynasty sort of fumbled their way through the 2 decades after Septimius' passing. The other 2 sources of trouble under the Severans were the army and the economy, and those 2 problems were related. Both of these problems began with Septimius, actually. You see, Severus had secured power through his ability as a soldier and with the help of the army. He was always considered an outsider by the Senate and the bureaucratic structure of Rome, so Severus had not gotten along well with the Senate. In fact, he despised the Senate. Thus Septimius did all he could to secure the loyalties of the army, and he did this by increasing the salary of the soldiers. In fact, he almost doubled their pay, which is nice, but it caused an influx of inflation. This began to weaken the economy and the stability of coinage, but the empire was able to cope. Yet for some reason, after Severus died, Caracalla decided to emulate his father and raise the pay of the soldiers once more. This move was downright idiotic, although I'm sure Caracalla was quite ignorant of any repercussions his actions might have had. Inflation occurred as a result once more, and this time the empire, its coinage and economy, was not able to cope. The Roman army had always taken up a majority of Rome's budget, usually over 80% actually, but now the pay of the army was crippling the Roman economy because there simply was not enough silver in currency. You see, this was an era without paper money and credit was essentially non-existent. So money was literally valued by the weight of gold, silver, or copper in the coins. Thus, to further illustrate the Severans' problems, think of it like this. They were spending roughly 100 silver denarii every year, but they were only minting 80 silver denarii to match them. Now those numbers are made up, but the point is that there was not enough valuable metal in circulation to match the expenditures, and in the ancient world, if the accounting books didn't match, that was a very big problem. To try and resolve this situation, the Severan administration tried several things. Raising taxes would not work because it would only exacerbate the damage, and it would not actually put more coinage back into the system. So what do you think they did? Well, the options were as follows. The empire could decrease the weight of the denarii, introduce new coins with heightened values, or they could put more denarii into the system. The Severans and later emperors tried all of those options and more still, but they did not work. They failed to relieve the system because although decreasing the weight of the coins uses less silver, this loss of weight does not go unnoticed by the users of such coinage, and so the value drops even more. And once the value of a coin drops, it is almost impossible for it to recover. And the introduction of new silver pieces did not work either, and for similar reasons. For example, Caracalla introduced a new coin known as the Antoninus, which was to be a silver piece worth 2 denarii. That alone was not bad at all, but the coin was overvalued because it did not have the same amount of silver as 2 denarii. So if a denarii weighed 0.8 grams, then the Antonine coin should weigh about 1.6 grams, but in reality, they weighed it at a cool 1.4 grams. And this trick of measurements did not fool the system for very long. The last option I mentioned is the introduction of more silver denarius coins into the economy. And I should explain what that means by the introduction of more denarii. That does not refer to the reminting of old coins. Rome had always minted and reminted their coinage frequently. No, I am referring to the introduction of entirely new coins of entirely new metals into the Roman economy. And this would actually be a legitimate option, and many ancient societies, the Romans included, would do this from time to time in order to stabilize coinage or to make up for increased demand for whatever reason. But as I said, this did not work either. So why? Well, Rome did not have access to new reserves of silver, and worse still, people were beginning to not even spend silver because its value was so erratic, and this exacerbated the problem because such actions took even more silver out of circulation because people weren't using it and therefore it wasn't going back into the reminting process. So in order to try and make up for all these problems, the mints began to dilute the purity of the silver denarius with copper. This worked momentarily, much like the overvalued 2 silver pieces, But this dilution of the denarius turned not just bad, but downright horrendous. The denarius, and all silver coinage for that matter, became almost utterly worthless, and over 90% copper or bronze. Many of these coins still exist. They look nothing like silver coins. You can see for yourself. And this great change in the coinage of Rome occurred very quickly, around 2 decades, and by then the denarius was lost and beyond saving. This caused a negative feedback system and caused hyperinflation across the Roman world. This shook the Roman economy to its core. And the reason I detailed that economic history is because it is paramount to understanding why Rome fell into chaos during the 3rd century, or part of the reason why. For the economy didn't just stall or halt, it straight collapsed beyond anything we can really comprehend. The economy ground to a halt because people's money was worth nothing. And that brings us back around to the death of Alexander Severus, or rather, his assassination. He was assassinated by the army, and they did so because their pay was essentially worthless, and they sought change. So in fact, the Severans had accelerated their downfall by raising the pay of their soldiers. It goes to show that giving people what they want is often not in their best interest. After the end of the Severan dynasty, the Roman Empire spiraled downwards. Not only had the economy collapsed, but the entire social structure was in shambles. The period after Alexander Severus' death is known as the Crisis of the 3rd century and lasted from 235 to 284 CE. During this period, the Roman Empire, as it was designed by Augustus, was reeling. There were more than 50 emperors during the time of imperial anarchy, and most are not even worth mentioning. And during these decades of instability, the empire was wrested and tested from all directions. There were foreign invasions, civil wars, barbaric uprising, and lots of plain old lawlessness. Not many documents survive from this period, making it a very difficult time to flesh out. I am obliged to give you a short abridged version. An emperor by the name of Valerian was defeated by the new Persians in 260, and his co-emperor and son, Gallienus, assumed full control. But with Valerian now dead, who had provided some much-needed stability, the empire cracked under Gallienus. In fact, the Roman Empire split into 3 forms. 2 runaway states broke off under Gallienus. These 2 runaway empires were the Gallic and Palmyran empires. The Gallic Empire was in the east, based primarily in Gaul, but Palmyra was in the Near East and ruled by the very famous Queen Zenobia. Gallienus could do nothing to rein these states back in, but after his death in 268, a new line of emperors assumed control of the wounded carcass of the Roman Principate. These were the soldier emperors of Illyria. One such emperor was Aurelian, who was nicknamed Old Hand on Sword. So it comes as no surprise that Aurelian was an exceptional general. He ruled from 270 to 275 and reconquered the Gallic and Palmyran empires. For his great efforts, Aurelian was known as the restorer of the world, or the restorer of the universe. Yet despite his great efforts, he was not able to provide true stability. That was left to another soldier emperor by the name of Diocletian. Diocletian took full control in 284 and ruled until his retirement in 305 CE. His longevity alone as emperor is a testament to his power and command of the empire. During Diocletian's decades of rule, he provided and nurtured a new foundation for the future of the Roman imperial system. He tried about everything in the book and off the top of his head to try and restore prosperity. Most of his strategies failed, including most of his efforts regarding the economy. He also famously implemented the tetrarchy, meaning rule by 4, to try and provide a stable system of succession. But that failed miserably despite the merit of the idea. But what Diocletian did do, aside from simply surviving, which mind you was an exceptional and important feat in itself, was to create essentially a new version of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Diocletian ushered in the late Roman Empire and did away with Augustus's Principate. The Principate was outdated, and Diocletian realized that the emperor needed to be more than just the princeps of Rome. The emperor needed to be the master of Rome. So he did just that, and Diocletian began the formation of the Dominate, which gets its name from the Latin noun dominus, which means lord and or master. And thereby, the emperor during the late empire, or Dominate, had far greater status. No longer was he first citizen amongst the Romans, he was the master of all. After Diocletian retired in 305, though, the Roman Empire quickly returned to anarchy when the Tetrarchy failed. It wasn't truly a return to societal anarchy, but a return to the civil wars. The person who emerged from nearly a decade of civil conflict was the great Constantine. Constantine reigned until his death and improved greatly upon the work of Diocletian in all respects. It is also well known that Constantine transformed the Roman policy on Christianity. He made Christianity a legal religion in 313 with the Edict of Milan, and was baptized in the faith on his deathbed. Now his motives for this were likely not exactly noble, but he nevertheless institutionalized this change. And if you're curious, Christianity had of course been around since Christ, and over the centuries had been gaining more and more acceptance, and it was Constantine who finally stopped the imperial resistance to the Christian faith. On a final note, he also shifted power to the east, to the ancient city of Byzantium, renaming it Nova Roma, or New Rome. It soon became known, however, as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This is currently the modern city of Istanbul in Turkey. Now this brings everything up to the time that Ammianus Marcellinus wrote about. But as I have mentioned before, we are missing his first 13 books. So, on the next episode, I will begin to read Ammianus Marcellinus' History of the Late Empire, beginning with Book 14 that details the history of Constantine's descendants, who ruled after his death in 337.
Thank you very much.